until he makes it all the way up here.
That was very nice of you. Most of the time, it's like up here. Hi, everybody. How are you? I think when you think of rebels, you think of like James Dean, Che Guevara, the guy who decided it was a good idea to take his shoes off on an airplane. You don't think of, thank you if someone got that joke, because that's disgusting. Like, who would ever think, like, oh, we're 30,000 feet in the air. Let me treat it like my living room. You don't think of Bill and Kathleen Kupsey, my parents. My parents were two Irish and Polish Catholics from Philadelphia, and I knew absolutely nothing of their lives prior to them getting married. I remember one time I asked my mom, I said, hey, Mom, you got married at 22. What was it like, you know, when younger? Like, what was your life like? And she laughed at me. She goes, I'm not your friend. So I went to my dad, who got married. They were married in 1969, and he was 28 at that time. So he had a lot of living, because I'm pretty sure in the 60s, like, your life expectancy was like 40, right? Is that how it works? I'm kidding. So I asked my dad, I said, Dad, you didn't get married till you were 28. Like, what did you do with your life? You must have dated a lot of girls. And he turned to me and goes, the only woman that ever mattered was your mother. And then he went back to reading the newspaper and never spoke about it again. So I knew next to nothing about my parents, so I had to kind of like piece some of it together through like relatives and friends. I knew that my mother was born in West Philadelphia, would eventually end up in Upper Darby, and go to Prendy, or as she called it, the little whorehouse on the hill. She was tiny, loud, opinionated, dyed her hair red, because who wants to fit in, and very good with people, an astute observer, and a wonderful woman, and very warm. To give you a better idea of what my mother was like, my sex talk with my mother consisted of us sitting at our kitchen table and her taking a very long pull from a Virginia Slim, and she said, keep your pecker in your pocket. Thanks, Mom, I'm 8. My father was raised in a Polish enclave in Northeast Philadelphia. He graduated high school a year early, was brilliant. He joined the Navy, became a CB, which is construction battalion, and then would go on, graduate college, and stay in Philadelphia because, hey, Polish people don't go anywhere. And so I knew nothing about my parents at all. Like, my dad was really cool, I knew that. He had traveled the world through work, Navy, all these different things. Think of like Anthony Bourdain, but like without the heroin addiction and cursing. And that would be my dad. And my dad was also like very cool, and not cool like, oh, you kids can come in and smoke pot and drink in the basement, but like cool like he knew a lot about jazz, and he knew a lot about art, and he knew pretty much something about everything. And his son, me, I can tell you where all the Popeyes are in a 30-mile radius. Like, I don't know anything. So, but I did find out how they met. My mother graduated college and began to work for the same company my father did. And my mother, by her accounts, fell in love with him instantly. At a company picnic a few weeks later, she told my dad that she didn't know how to get home from the picnic. So my father had to follow her home. And I remember when she was telling me this, she goes, yeah, I completely lied to your father. I just wanted him to come home and make out with me. Mom, I'm 8. I'm 8. They would get engaged 4 months later, and they would remain married for 22 years until my mother passed away. Years later, I would myself get engaged, and at this point, my father was 67, and he was right at the end of his life. So I took him to Perkins to celebrate, you know, the place where cuisine goes to die. And I remember telling him, I said, hey, Dad, I'm getting engaged, and he was very happy. He was over the moon. And I said, hey, Dad, why don't you tell me about your engagement? We've never had this discussion. So he began to tell me, and I said, hey, Dad, did you ask my grandfather's permission? And he said, no. And which really kind of threw me off, because my dad was very old school. He always made us, his children, carry a hanky. We weren't allowed to wear hats in the house. Like, if I walked in with a hat in the house, he would take it off me and like throw it out in the yard. Like, he was like a Nazi, kind of. If you want to know what a Nazi is, just ask Sean Spicer, because clearly he's one. So it struck me as odd that my father, this man who was very chivalrous, who held on to all these old traditions, wouldn't ask my grandfather for my mother's hand in marriage. And I said, well, Dad, none of this makes sense. Like, how could you do that? This was the 1960s. And he got really serious. And he took off his glasses, and he looked at me and said, son, it wasn't his choice whether your mother wanted to marry me or not. It was hers. And I was like, whoa. I was like, wow, like I never really thought of that, Dad. Like, that's really neat. And then he looked at me. Like, we made this connection finally. Like, I finally knew how my parents got engaged, how they got married. And then he looked at me and said, son, don't order the Scrapple here. It's terrible. Why did you take me to Perkins? Thanks a lot, guys.
Nick, everybody.